My father called my cybersecurity work playing on computers. His CEO friend saw my clearance level and went pale. The wine glass in my father's hand stopped halfway to his mouth when David Thornfield said it. "Richard, do you have any idea what clearance level your son holds?" His voice had gone quiet. Careful, the way people talk when they've just realized they've walked into a conversation they weren't prepared for. My father set the glass down on the granite kitchen island with enough force to make the stem ring. "Alex does computer work for the government. Types code, fixes servers, whatever it is those IT people do. Nothing particularly impressive." He said it loud enough that my mother, my sister Nicole, and Nicole's husband Stephen all heard from the living room where they'd been discussing Stephen's recent promotion to vice president at his commercial real estate firm. Loud enough that I heard it clearly from where I stood near the patio doors, watching the sunset over my parents' perfectly manicured backyard in their gated community outside McLean, Virginia. I'd been working in cybersecurity for the Department of Defense for 9 years when that conversation happened, the last 6 of which had been spent doing work I literally could not discuss outside specific secure facilities without violating federal law and multiple non-disclosure agreements that carried criminal penalties. My name is Alex Brennan. I'm 33 years old, and I held a top-secret/sensitive compartmented information clearance with additional special access program authorizations that meant I worked on systems and projects that most people with security clearances didn't even know existed. My official title was Senior Cybersecurity Engineer with the Defense Information Systems Agency. But my actual work involved offensive cyber operations, vulnerability research, and classified network defense that I could not describe to anyone outside my chain of command and the handful of civilians with appropriate clearances and need-to-know authorizations. The paperwork I'd signed when I joined my current program made it crystal clear that unauthorized disclosure could result in up to 20 years in federal prison, loss of clearance, and civil penalties that would bankrupt me for life. So when family asked what I did, I said I worked in cybersecurity for the Department of Defense, which was technically accurate, but left out approximately 95% of what my job actually involved. Most people accepted this with some variation of, "That sounds interesting," or "You must be good with computers." My mother understood that government work sometimes involved classified information. Nicole, who was 31 and worked as a marketing director for a pharmaceutical company, generally didn't ask detailed questions about anyone's career unless it related to her own professional network. But my father, Richard Brennan, who at 58 was the founder and CEO of Brennan Capital Management, a private equity firm that managed over $3 billion in assets, had decided years ago that my inability to discuss specifics about my work meant I didn't do anything significant. It had started gradually, small comments at family dinners about how his investments funded real innovation while I maintained government computers, jokes about how I'd gone to MIT for computer science but ended up in a bureaucratic government job instead of founding a startup or joining a prestigious tech company where I could have made real money. References to my work as basically IT support, comparisons to his firm's actual achievements in growing companies and creating value, suggestions that I'd taken the safe, easy path instead of proving myself in the real world. I'd tried explaining that cybersecurity for critical defense systems was important work, that protecting national security infrastructure mattered even if I couldn't describe specific projects. But every explanation came across as defensive because I couldn't provide concrete examples. Couldn't tell him about the advanced persistent threat I'd helped identify and neutralize last year. Couldn't mention the zero-day vulnerability my team had discovered in widely deployed military systems before adversaries could exploit it. Couldn't describe the classified operation where our intelligence prevented a significant cyber attack on critical infrastructure. Everything I'd worked on for the past 6 years was classified at levels that meant I couldn't even acknowledge whether specific programs existed. So my father's narrative had calcified into family mythology over time. He was the successful entrepreneur who'd built a billion-dollar firm from nothing, and I was the son who'd wasted an MIT education on a government job that paid a fraction of what I could earn in private sector and involved playing on computers in some anonymous office building. And watching him receive respect and admiration from family and business associates while treating my career as essentially clerical work, I'd grown quietly furious in a way that had no safe outlet. If you are enjoying this story already, please subscribe to see more stories like this. David Thornfield was looking at my father now with an expression somewhere between disbelief and concern. He was maybe 55, fit in the expensive gym way that successful executives maintain, with silver hair and the kind of weathered face that suggested he'd spent considerable time outdoors despite working in corporate environments. My father had mentioned that David was CEO of Thornfield Systems, a defense contractor that manufactured communications equipment and electronic warfare systems for military clients, and that they'd known each other for 15 years through various business and social connections. David had been invited to this family dinner because he was in town for meetings, and my father enjoyed entertaining business associates at home, showing off his success through his house, his wine collection, and his perfectly curated family. "Richard," David said again, and his tone had shifted to something more serious, almost formal. What exactly do you think Alex does? My father shrugged, clearly annoyed at being questioned about his own son's career. He works for some Department of Defense agency doing cybersecurity, computer networks, firewalls, whatever. It's government IT work. Steady paycheck, decent benefits, nothing particularly challenging or innovative. Not like building actual companies or creating real value in the market. The contempt in his voice was familiar enough that I barely reacted anymore. This was standard dinner conversation in the Brennan household whenever my career came up. David set down his own wine glass carefully and pulled out his phone. What agency did you say? My father waved dismissively. DISA, I think? Defense Information Systems? One of those alphabet soup government bureaucracies? David typed something into his phone, then looked at me directly for the first time since this conversation started. Alex, do you mind if I ask what your current clearance level is? I felt my stomach tighten because I knew where this was going and I knew it wouldn't end well. I can't discuss specifics about my clearance or my work, I said, giving him the standard response I'd been trained to use. I work in cybersecurity for DISA, and some of my assignments require various levels of access to classified information. David nodded slowly, still looking at me with that assessing expression. Would it be accurate to say you hold a TS/SCI clearance? I kept my face neutral. I'm not authorized to confirm specific clearance levels or special access programs, which was itself an answer, and David was clearly experienced enough with defense contracting to understand what that non-confirmation meant. He turned back to my father, and his expression had gone completely serious. Richard, your son isn't doing IT support. He's doing work that requires one of the highest security clearances the United States government issues. TS/SCI with special access means he's working on programs that are compartmented beyond normal classification. The people who hold those clearances are working on things that could compromise national security if disclosed. They're not fixing computers or managing firewalls. My father laughed, but it sounded uncertain. Come on, David. It's still computer work. He sits in an office somewhere typing code. It's not like he's doing anything particularly dangerous or important. David's expression shifted to something closer to frustration. Do you have any idea how hard it is to get that level of clearance? The background investigation alone takes over a year. They interview everyone you've ever known. They review your entire financial history, every foreign contact, every relationship. The failure rate is significant because most people can't pass the scrutiny, and the work itself requires expertise that most cybersecurity professionals don't have. If Alex holds the clearance I think he does, he's in the top fraction of 1% of people in his field. The living room had gone silent. I could see Nicole and Stephen watching this exchange with growing interest. My mother had appeared in the kitchen doorway, holding her wine glass and looking confused about why the conversation had become tense. My father's face was reddening, the way it always did when someone challenged him on something he'd stated as fact. I'm sure the clearance process is rigorous, he said, his voice taking on the condescending tone he used when explaining things to people he considered less knowledgeable. But at the end of the day, Alex is still just doing computer security for a government agency. It's not like he's building companies, managing significant assets, or doing anything that requires real leadership or strategic thinking. It's technical work. Important in its own way, sure, but not exactly groundbreaking. David picked up his wine glass again, but instead of drinking, he held it while looking at my father with an expression I couldn't quite read. Richard, I've worked with DoD cybersecurity personnel for 20 years through my company's government contracts. The people doing the kind of work Alex likely does are among the most skilled technical professionals in the world. They're defending against nation-state adversaries with essentially unlimited resources. They're identifying vulnerabilities in critical systems before enemies can exploit them. They're conducting operations I can't discuss even in general terms. And they do it for government salaries that are a fraction of what they could earn in private sector because they believe the mission matters. My father opened his mouth to respond, but David wasn't finished. The fact that Alex can't tell you what he does isn't because his work isn't important. It's because his work is so important that disclosure could damage national security. The secrecy is the evidence of significance, not the absence of it. He paused, then added, and for the record, my company has tried to recruit people with Alex's level of clearance and expertise. We offer salaries starting around $300,000 with significant bonuses and equity. Most of them turn us down because they're committed to the mission. So when you suggest your son took the easy path or isn't doing challenging work, you're fundamentally misunderstanding what his career actually involves. The silence that followed was thick and uncomfortable. My father stood there holding his wine glass, his face still red, clearly struggling with having his long-held narrative about my career dismantled by someone whose opinion he actually respected. Nicole was staring at me like she'd never seen me before. Stephen looked uncomfortable, probably recognizing that the family dynamic had just shifted in ways that would make future gatherings awkward. My mother moved further into the kitchen, her expression shifting between confusion and something that might have been hurt. Alex, why didn't you tell us your work was so classified? She asked, and her voice carried an edge of accusation, as if I'd been deliberately withholding information to make them feel bad. I felt the familiar frustration rise, The same feeling I'd experienced countless times over the years when trying to explain something I legally couldn't explain. I did tell you it was classified. Multiple times. I've said repeatedly that I can't discuss my work because of security requirements. What else was I supposed to say? My father set his glass down hard enough that wine sloshed over the rim. You could have explained that you were doing something actually important instead of letting us think you were just another government IT worker doing basic computer maintenance. The accusation in his voice made my hands want to form fists. I literally could not have explained that without violating federal law, I said, keeping my voice level through years of practice at controlling emotional responses under pressure. The fact that you interpreted my inability to discuss specifics as evidence that my work wasn't significant says more about your assumptions than my communication. David cleared his throat. I should probably go. I didn't mean to cause family tension. But my father waved him off. No, stay. Clearly we're learning things about Alex's career that he should have made clearer years ago. The dinner fell apart quickly after that. We moved through the meal my mother had prepared, salmon and roasted vegetables and a salad that probably cost more than most families spent on weekly groceries. But the conversation was stilted and awkward. My father kept making comments that were technically supportive, but carried undertones of resentment. Well, now that we know Alex is doing such important classified work, I suppose we should be more impressed. Or, I guess government salaries are worth it when you're working on programs so secret you can't even acknowledge they exist. Nicole tried to ask questions about what I did, but every question required responses I couldn't give. Do you work with the NSA? Can't confirm or deny. Have you ever stopped a cyber attack? Can't discuss specific operations. Is your work related to what happened with that Russian hacking thing in the news? Can't comment on current events or relate them to my work. Stephen, to his credit, eventually changed the subject to something neutral, and we finished the meal in tense politeness. David left shortly after dinner, shaking my hand on his way out and saying quietly, I meant what I said earlier. What you do matters, even if your family doesn't understand it yet. After he left, my mother wanted to have a conversation about why I'd never explained how classified my work was. She'd apparently spent the time during dinner on her phone searching for information about TS/SCI clearances and had found articles about security procedures and background investigations. I had no idea you were working on things this secret, she said, and her voice carried hurt underneath the words. We're your family. You should have trusted us enough to at least explain that your work was more than just regular IT support. I tried to explain, again, that I had told them repeatedly that my work was classified and that I couldn't discuss it, that the entire point of classification was that I couldn't provide details even to family members, that nothing had changed except David's recognition had forced them to reconsider assumptions they'd held for years, despite my attempts to correct them. But my mother seemed to think this was about trust rather than legal requirements, and the conversation went nowhere productive. The real fallout started in the following days. My father sent an email on Monday morning that read like a corporate memo. Subject line, discussion of your career. The body of the email said, Alex, I want to apologize if I've underestimated the nature of your work. David's comments made it clear that your position involves more responsibility than I'd understood. However, I'm disappointed that you weren't more transparent about the significance of your role. A simple explanation that your work required high-level clearances would have helped us appreciate your career path more accurately. Going forward, I hope we can have more open communication about these matters. The email bothered me on multiple levels. First, because it framed his years of dismissive comments as a misunderstanding I'd caused by not explaining things properly, rather than acknowledging that he'd spent close to a decade mocking my career based on his own assumptions. Second, because he was still fundamentally missing the point that I literally could not have explained things more clearly without violating security protocols. And third, because his apology was conditional and focused on his disappointment in me rather than recognition of how his behavior had been hurtful. I didn't respond immediately because any response I drafted sounded either passive-aggressive or openly angry, and I'd learned from years of military-style professional training that responding, while emotional, rarely improved situations. Instead, I focused on my actual work, which that week involved a time-sensitive project related to vulnerability assessment of classified communication systems. The work required 16-hour days in a SCIF, the kind of windowless secure facility where phones weren't allowed, and every conversation happened under the assumption that national security depended on maintaining operational security. It was demanding, intellectually challenging work that required expertise in advanced persistent threats, zero-day exploits, network architecture, and adversarial tactics. The kind of work that maybe 24 people in the country were qualified to do at this level. And I was good at it. The recognition from colleagues who understood what we did mattered more than any validation from family. But the situation with my father still bothered me, because part of me wanted him to genuinely understand and acknowledge what I'd accomplished, while another part recognized he might never get there. Nicole called on Wednesday. I've been thinking about Sunday, she said, her voice careful. I had no idea you were working on classified programs. You always just said you did cybersecurity, and I thought that meant like protecting government websites or something. I appreciated that she at least recognized there was a distinction between what she'd thought I did and what I actually did. The work is more technical than that, I said, giving her the same general explanation I'd given dozens of times. I work on defensive systems and vulnerability research for critical defense networks. Most of the specifics are classified, so I can't really describe day-to-day activities or specific projects. There was a pause. Dad's been really defensive since Sunday. He keeps saying you made him look stupid in front of his friend. The accusation stung because I hadn't said anything at dinner. David had been the one who'd challenged my father's assumptions. I didn't make Dad look any particular way, I said. David asked questions and drew conclusions based on his own experience with defense contractors and security clearances. I barely spoke during that entire conversation. Nicole sighed. I know, but you know how Dad is. He doesn't like being corrected, especially in front of people he's trying to impress. And now he's embarrassed that he's been dismissing your work for years in front of the whole family. The fact that Nicole recognized this pattern but still seemed to be suggesting I should somehow manage my father's embarrassment irritated me. Maybe Dad should be embarrassed, I said. He spent close to a decade making jokes about how my career wasn't real work, suggesting I'd wasted my education, comparing my government salary unfavorably to what I could make in private sector. He did all of that knowing I couldn't defend myself or explain what I actually did without violating security protocols. The fact that it turns out he was completely wrong about the nature and significance of my work isn't my fault. Nicole was quiet for a moment. You're right. I'm sorry. I think we all just kind of accepted Dad's version of things because he seemed so confident about it, and you never pushed back very hard. I wanted to point out that I had pushed back, repeatedly, by explaining that my work was classified and important, even if I couldn't describe specifics. But I'd learned that people often didn't register those explanations unless they chose to take them seriously, and my family had chosen not to. I need to go, I told Nicole. I have work, which was true, but also a convenient excuse to end an uncomfortable conversation. If this story keeps your interest, please subscribe to get more stories like this. The situation deteriorated further over the next few weeks. My father apparently told several business associates about the dinner conversation, framing it as, discovering my son does more important work than I'd realized. Word spread through his professional network, which overlapped with various defense industry and government contracting circles in the D.C. area. People who'd heard my father dismiss my career for years at networking events and business dinners now heard a different story. And some of them, particularly those who worked in or around the defense and intelligence communities, had reactions similar to David's. I heard about this through a colleague at work, Dr. Raymond Foster, who was a technical director in our division and had over 25 years of experience in DoD cybersecurity. Raymond pulled me aside one afternoon in early December, about 3 weeks after the dinner. Alex, I heard something interesting yesterday. Was at an industry conference and ran into Richard Brennan. When I mentioned I worked at DISA, he asked if I knew you. Spent 10 minutes telling me about how he'd recently learned you worked on highly classified programs and held significant security clearances. I felt my stomach sink. What exactly did he say? Raymond's expression suggested he found the situation both amusing and concerning. He was very proud, actually. Talked about how you'd gone to MIT, how you worked on programs he couldn't discuss because they were so classified, how defense contractors had tried to recruit you for six-figure salaries, which was all fine. Except several people at that conference have known you professionally for years and have heard your father make very different comments about your career in the past. He paused. One person specifically mentioned that Richard had said at a previous event that you'd settled for a government IT job instead of doing something challenging in private sector. The contrast was noticeable. I closed my eyes briefly. He's been dismissive of my work for years. Recently found out it was more significant than he'd assumed. Now apparently he's overcorrecting. Raymond nodded. The defense industry is a small community. People remember. And when someone spends years diminishing their own son's career and then suddenly starts bragging about it once they realize they were wrong, it doesn't reflect well on their judgment or character. Several people at that conference mentioned they'd be more cautious about doing business with someone who could be that fundamentally wrong about something so close to home. The irony wasn't lost on me. My father's reputation in circles that valued understanding of defense and intelligence work was suffering because people were judging him based on how he'd treated my career. The same way he'd damaged my credibility with family members for years by constantly suggesting my work wasn't significant. I didn't ask for this, I said. Raymond smiled slightly. I know you didn't, but actions have consequences. Your father spent years broadcasting his opinion that your work was unimportant. Now people in professional contexts are reassessing their opinion of him based on that behavior. It's not your responsibility to manage his reputation. He was right, but it still felt complicated because these were consequences I hadn't intended and didn't necessarily want. I just wanted my father to acknowledge that he'd been wrong and that his behavior had been hurtful. I didn't want his business relationships to suffer, even if part of me felt like he deserved some professional embarrassment for the personal embarrassment he'd caused me. The situation came to a head at Christmas. My parents hosted their annual Christmas Eve dinner, a formal affair where extended family, close friends, and select business associates gathered for an elaborate meal. I almost didn't go, but my mother had called 3 times begging me to attend and saying it would mean a lot to her. I agreed reluctantly, knowing it would probably be awkward. The evening started typically enough: expensive wine, catered food, conversation about stock markets and real estate and various people's professional achievements. My father was in his element, playing the successful host, discussing his firm's recent acquisitions and returns. Then, about an hour into the gathering, he called for everyone's attention. "I want to make a toast," he said, standing near the fireplace with a glass of wine. "This year has been full of learning experiences, both professionally and personally. One of the most significant has been gaining a deeper appreciation for my son Alex's career. I felt every muscle in my body tense. This was not something I'd agreed to or wanted." My father continued, oblivious to my discomfort. "For years, I didn't fully understand what Alex did for the Department of Defense. I knew he worked in cybersecurity, but I didn't realize the significance of his work or the level of expertise it required. Recently, a colleague helped me understand that Alex works on highly classified programs that are critical to national security. He holds security clearances that most people never qualify for, and does work that I literally cannot discuss because it's that important." People were looking at me with interest now. My aunt and uncle, family friends, several of my father's business associates. I wanted to disappear. My father raised his glass. "So I want to publicly acknowledge that I was wrong to underestimate Alex's career, and I'm proud of the work he does even though I don't fully understand it. To Alex, and to all the professionals doing classified work to keep our country safe." People raised their glasses and drank. Someone started clapping. The attention felt horrible, like being exposed under bright lights. After the toast, people wanted to talk to me about my work. My uncle asked what agency I worked for. My father's business partner wanted to know if I could discuss any of my projects. A family friend asked if my work was related to recent news about cyber attacks. Every question required variations of, "I can't discuss that," or "that information is classified." And with each non-answer, I could see people's expressions shift from interest to something like disappointment or confusion. They wanted stories, details, something concrete to attach to my father's dramatic toast, but I couldn't provide any of that. The evening felt interminable. When I finally left around 10 p.m., pleading early morning work commitments, my father followed me to my car. "I thought the toast was appropriate," he said, "giving you recognition for your work." I turned to face him in the cold December night, my breath visible in the air. "Dad, I don't need public recognition. I need you to actually understand why what you did for years was hurtful and wrong." He looked genuinely confused. I apologized. I acknowledged I was wrong about the nature of your work. "What more do you want?" I'd spent weeks thinking about this conversation, about what I actually needed from him. "I want you to understand that you didn't just misunderstand my job. You actively diminished my career at every family gathering for close to a decade. You made jokes about how I'd wasted my education. You compared my work unfavorably to yours. You suggested I'd taken the easy path. And you did all of that knowing I couldn't defend myself without violating security protocols. That wasn't a misunderstanding, Dad. That was years of disrespect." My father's jaw tightened. "I've said I'm sorry. I've publicly acknowledged your work. I don't know what else you expect from me." The frustration I'd been controlling for weeks finally broke through. "I expect you to actually take responsibility instead of framing this as a misunderstanding I caused by not explaining things better. I told you repeatedly that my work was classified and important. You chose not to believe me. You chose to construct a narrative where my career was insignificant because it made you feel better about yourself. And now that someone you respect told you that you were wrong, you're embarrassed and trying to save face by overcorrecting with public toasts and bragging to your business associates." My father stepped back slightly, his expression hardening. "That's unfair. I've admitted I was wrong. You're being unreasonable by holding on to this anger." I laughed, but it wasn't a happy sound. "You know what's unreasonable? Spending 9 years working in one of the most demanding fields in cybersecurity, protecting systems that keep this country safe, and having your own father tell everyone who'll listen that you're basically doing IT support. That's unreasonable, Dad. Me being angry about it is a pretty rational response." He didn't have an answer for that. We stood there in the cold for another moment before I got in my car and drove home. The conversation with my father replayed in my mind during the drive. Part of me had wanted him to actually understand, to acknowledge the specific ways his behavior had been hurtful, and to apologize for those specific actions, but I was starting to realize he might never get there. His ego wouldn't allow him to fully admit he'd been that wrong about something so important for that long. The best I might get was the performative apology and public recognition he'd already given, which felt hollow, but was apparently all he was capable of offering. The professional consequences for my father continued to accumulate. In January, I heard through Raymond that Thornfield Systems had decided not to pursue a joint venture with my father's firm that would have involved government contracting work. David Thornfield had apparently expressed concerns about my father's judgment and understanding of the defense industry, citing the incident at Thanksgiving as evidence that he didn't grasp the significance of classified work or respect the people who did it. The deal would have been worth several million in fees to my father's firm. In February, my father lost out on a board position with the Defense Industry Trade Association. The selection committee included several people who worked in or around the intelligence community and who'd heard about how he'd treated my career. One of them apparently said in the committee meeting that they needed board members who understood and respected all aspects of defense work, not just the profitable parts. My father blamed me for these consequences, sent an email in March accusing me of deliberately damaging his reputation in the defense industry. I responded that I hadn't told anyone outside our immediate family about the Thanksgiving incident, that if his reputation was suffering, it was because David and others were judging him based on his own behavior, and that maybe he should consider why people in the defense and intelligence communities were reacting negatively to learning how he'd treated his son's service to the country. He didn't respond to that email. The silence between us stretched into months. We didn't speak at all between March and July. My mother tried to mediate, suggesting we were both being stubborn and should reconcile for the sake of family harmony. I told her I was willing to have a relationship with my father, but only if he genuinely acknowledged what he'd done wrong and apologized sincerely. She said I was asking too much, that families should forgive each other's flaws. I said there was a difference between flaws and sustained patterns of disrespect, and that forgiving my father without him acknowledging the specific harm he'd caused would just enable future bad behavior. Nicole called periodically to give me updates on family dynamics. Apparently my father had become defensive and bitter, complaining that people were overreacting to a simple misunderstanding about job descriptions. He'd stopped mentioning my career entirely in professional contexts, which meant his earlier overcorrection had been replaced by complete avoidance of the topic. My mother was stressed about the family tension. Nicole herself felt caught in the middle, wanting to maintain relationships with both her father and her brother, but recognizing that we had fundamentally different perspectives on what had happened and what resolution would look like. In August, 9 months after the Thanksgiving dinner, my father called me. It was a Sunday afternoon, and I was home working on some personal coding projects. Seeing his name on my phone screen made me hesitate before answering. Alex, his voice sounded tired, older than I remembered. I was hoping we could meet and talk, in person, not over phone or email. I was skeptical, but agreed. We met at a coffee shop in Arlington, neutral territory halfway between his house and my apartment. He looked older when he arrived, more gray in his hair than I remembered, and there was something deflated in his posture that I hadn't seen before. We ordered coffee and sat in uncomfortable silence for a minute before he spoke. I've been doing a lot of thinking since last year, my father said, his voice quieter than usual, less confident. I've talked to David and some other people in the defense industry. I've read articles about cybersecurity and national security. I've had some long conversations with a therapist your mother insisted I see, and I've realized I've been completely wrong about your career and how I've treated you. The admission surprised me because I'd expected defensiveness or justification, not acknowledgement. He continued, staring at his coffee cup rather than making eye contact. I think I knew on some level that your work was important, but admitting that would have meant accepting that you'd chosen a more meaningful career path than I had in some ways. And I'd built so much of my identity around being the successful businessman, the father who'd built a billion-dollar firm and provided for his family. Having a son who might be doing more important work for society threatened that identity. So I diminished your work, made jokes about it, convinced myself and everyone else that you were basically doing IT support. It made me feel better about myself, and I didn't acknowledge how much it hurt you. I sipped my coffee, waiting to see if he'd continue. My father looked at me directly for the first time. The thing is, I spent years building my reputation on having good judgment about people and businesses. Being that fundamentally wrong about my own son's career for that long has made people question my judgment generally. I've lost business opportunities, I've lost respect from colleagues, and somehow I made it your fault in my mind, like you should have forced me to understand, instead of recognizing that I chose not to listen. He pulled an envelope from his jacket and slid it across the table. I wrote you a letter. A real apology where I take specific responsibility for specific things I did and said that were hurtful and disrespectful. I don't expect immediate forgiveness, or maybe any forgiveness, but I needed to acknowledge what I did and try to make it right, even if it's too late. I took the envelope but didn't open it yet. Why now? Why did it take 9 months and professional consequences for you to realize you'd been treating me badly? My father winced, but didn't look away. Because I'm stubborn and arrogant, and I didn't want to admit I'd been wrong. I told myself you were being oversensitive, that it was just normal father-son ribbing, that you should have explained things more clearly if it really bothered you. I made every excuse possible. Then I lost that joint venture with Thornfield Systems. David told me directly that he couldn't work with someone who'd spent years disrespecting their own son's service to the country. That got through to me in a way nothing else had. There was silence between us, coffee shop noise filling the space. I spent 9 years building expertise in one of the most complex technical fields in existence, I said finally, my voice steady despite emotion behind it. 9 years defending critical systems against sophisticated adversaries. 9 years doing work that mattered for national security. And the entire time, my own father was telling everyone who'd listen that I'd wasted my potential on a government job that wasn't real work. Do you have any idea how demoralizing that was? coming home for holidays and having to sit through your jokes and condescension while knowing I couldn't defend myself, couldn't explain what I actually did? My father nodded, his eyes wet. I know, and I'm sorry. That's inadequate. I know it doesn't undo years of damage, but I am genuinely sorry. You deserved support and respect from me, and instead I gave you mockery and dismissal. I was a terrible father in this respect, and I'm trying to be better now, even if it's too late to fix what I broke. I opened the envelope and read his letter. It was 4 pages, handwritten, detailed, and specific about what he'd done wrong and how it had been hurtful and inappropriate. He acknowledged specific incidents I'd mentioned in past conversations, things I'd assumed he'd forgotten or dismissed. He described the impact of learning from David and others, how significant my work likely was, and how ashamed he'd felt that strangers respected my career more than her own father had. He promised to do better, to actually listen when I said something was hurtful, to respect boundaries around classified information instead of treating secrecy as suspicious. The letter ended with a simple request that I give him a chance to rebuild trust and prove he'd changed. I folded the letter and put it back in the envelope. I appreciate this, I said. I appreciate that you're acknowledging what happened and taking responsibility, but I need you to understand that this isn't fixed just because you apologized. You spent years building a narrative about my career that damaged how our family sees me and how I see myself. Mom and Nicole treated my career as less important because you set that tone. I internalized some of that doubt, started questioning whether my work mattered because my own father didn't think it did. That damage doesn't disappear overnight. My father nodded. I know. And I'm willing to put in the work to rebuild trust if you'll let me. I'll correct the record with family. I'll acknowledge publicly when appropriate that I was wrong. I'll respect your boundaries and security requirements. I'll do whatever it takes. We talked for another 90 minutes, working through specific incidents and patterns of behavior, establishing boundaries and expectations for future interactions. It was difficult and uncomfortable, but it felt productive in a way our previous conversations never had. My father was finally listening, really listening, without defensiveness or excuses. When we left the coffee shop, we didn't hug or pretend everything was fine, but we'd established a foundation for potentially rebuilding our relationship. Over the following months, my father followed through on his promises. He called my mother and Nicole and had long conversations where he acknowledged he'd been wrong about my career and had let his ego drive him to diminish my accomplishments. He told them that while he still didn't know details of what I did, he'd learned enough to recognize it was significant and important. My mother called me afterward, saying she wished she'd understood sooner and that she was sorry for not recognizing how my father's behavior had affected me. The next Thanksgiving was different. My father was careful about how he discussed my career, redirecting any comments that suggested his business achievements were more legitimate than my government work. When conversation turned to careers, he actively praised the importance of public service and national security work. When someone asked what I did, and I gave my standard, "I work in cybersecurity for DoD, and most specifics are classified" response, my father added, "Which means it's important enough that the government prohibits disclosure. Alex is doing work that matters, even if we don't get to know the details." It was a small moment, but it mattered. The acknowledgement that secrecy indicated significance rather than insignificance, delivered by the person who'd spent years arguing the opposite. We weren't back to whatever normal had been before, and maybe we never would be, but we were building something new, a relationship based on actual respect rather than his need to feel superior. My career continued on its trajectory. I made GS-14 2 years after that Thanksgiving, transitioned to a new program focused on emerging threats, and eventually moved into a leadership role where I managed a team of analysts and engineers. The work remained classified, the specifics still hidden behind security protocols, but the people who needed to know understood its value. My father and I developed a functional relationship built on clear boundaries and mutual respect. He stopped asking about my work beyond general questions about my well-being and career satisfaction. I made an effort to acknowledge his business achievements, recognizing that my earlier dismissiveness of his work had probably contributed to his defensive behavior. We weren't close in the way some fathers and sons are, but we'd moved past active hostility to something resembling genuine family connection. The Thanksgiving incident became a reference point in our family, the moment when assumptions got challenged and relationships had to be rebuilt. My mother still occasionally mentions that she wishes she'd understood sooner. Nicole treats my career with genuine respect now, asking thoughtful questions and accepting when I can't answer. And my father, to his credit, has become protective of my career in family and professional contexts, shutting down anyone who suggests government work isn't as legitimate as private sector careers. I'm 37 now, still serving in cybersecurity, still doing work I can't describe to the people closest to me. The secrecy remains frustrating sometimes, the inability to share achievements or explain challenges, but I've learned that the right people understand without needing details. My value isn't determined by whether my family comprehends the specifics of my job. It's determined by the work itself, by the mission success, by the respect of colleagues who know what we do and why it matters. Everything else is just noise. Thanks for watching till the end. Make sure to subscribe and like to not miss the next story.